Alright, so I planned on making the last video and this one into one particular video. However, it turned out to be a lot longer than I thought it would be. And admittedly, there's a lot of content at the beginning of the last video that is kind of boring. However, I do think it is necessary, especially if you want to, do this stuff professionally. But pretty much everything I talked about in the last video is all you really need to know to make a very, very basic album cover. This is going to be a little bit more complex, but still not like the most, advanced stuff that you could be doing. But before I jump into that, I wanted to talk about some of these tools on the toolbar here on the left, because I kind of intuitively, kind of gravitate towards one or the other. And I might not necessarily mention it when I'm, kind of going through things because, intuitively I just know to do these things. But I know if you're starting out and, even trying to follow along, you might have trouble because, you might end up trying to do what I'm doing, but if you don't have the right tool selected, then it's not going to work out the way that it's supposed to or the way that it worked for me. So if you're trying to follow along with what I'm doing and you have some kind of issue, consider that you might need to look at whatever tool I have selected at that time. Like for example, this tool right here is called the Lasso Tool. If I click here and then drag, I can basically make a selection. I'm going to let go right now. And then it'll basically kind of make a selection based on how I drag the tool around. And if I have any type of selection that I've already made, like this one, all I need to do is click on the screen somewhere and that whole selection will disappear. So alternatively, I can also click on Control A, and that will select the entire image all around the border here. You can see that same little dotted line background. So if I want to unselect that, I just need to click on the screen. However, it only works when I have the Lasso tool. If I click on this tool up here and I press Control A, and then I click on the screen here, it doesn't actually do anything. So I need to make sure I have my Lasso tool selected when I click on the screen. That way it'll get rid of the selection. So this tool right here is actually what allows me to move things around. So I need to make sure that I have it selected if I'm trying to move an image around or, any of my layers or my text or whatever. I need to make sure that I have this tool selected. It's literally called the Move tool. And then all these other tools here, they have a purpose. I cover some of them. Like for example, the crop tool will allow you to kind of crop out an area. So it'll select this area, and then if I click enter, it'll basically get rid of everything in that image except for the area that I had selected. It crops everything out. But if I press Control and Z, it'll undo that. I'm not going to cover every single tool in the toolbar, but those are the two that I really wanted to point out, especially when following along, because if you select everything and you have the Move tool selected, this selection is not going to go anywhere. It is still there every time I click on the screen. And likewise, if I have the Lasso tool and I'm trying to, move an object, obviously that's not going to work out for me. The magic wand, which I talk about later, kind of works the same way, where it's making a selection. So as you can probably guess, I need to go to my Lasso tool and click here if I want to get rid of that. It won't work if I have this selection here and then I go to my Move tool and then I try to click here because it'll still be there. However, if I want to actually move something, I need to make sure I have my Move tool selected. So hopefully that won't, confuse you, especially later on. I'm going to be going back and forth between them. But now I'm just going to continue the video from where I left off in the last video. I just wanted to make sure that you knew that before I continue, and hopefully you don't get lost. Now, before I move on, I do want to talk about a couple different, text effects that you can do. So what I can do is I can go to this layer here where it says Drake, and I can click on it. And then I can go down here to where it says FX. And then I have a bunch of different effects that I can pick from. So let me just go ahead and click on Drop Shadow. And what that'll do is it'll bring up the entire text editor. These are all the same, options I had to pick from earlier. So Drop Shadow is basically kind of like a shadow underneath the text. So I'll show you that real quick. If I increase the size to something like, 87, and then distance, I can change that. And then real quick, let me turn up the opacity to about, 87, 85. And then hopefully you can see around the background, there's kind of this black shadow going on. So if I change the distance, it'll kind of move how far away from the text the shadow is. So here you can see it's a lot farther away. I can make it closer. Spread is basically how wide this, shadow is. And you can play with all these settings. I'm not going to get too in depth. There's a lot of, fine tuning with little things when you want to, get, the perfect effect going. For now, I'm okay with this. I'm going to go ahead and click on Color Overlay. So what I need to do is select this box, and that will, as you can see, change the color of the text. So if I click on Color Overlay, this actually allows me to change the options of the color overlay. As of now, they have this weird looking green color. I can left click and I can pick any other color. For example, if I wanted, red, I could go to green, green, yellow, orange. Let me click OK real quick, and I just want to move this box. Another thing I can do is if I click on this color panel, I can basically move my mouse anywhere onto the actual photo, and you can see that, you know, my cursor is now kind of this eyedropper tool. And essentially what that'll do is I can left click anywhere in this photo, and it'll select whatever pixel I'm left clicking, and it'll copy that color. On this side, we kind of have like a dark blue, maybe even a purple color. So if I left click here, it will change that color that I have selected right here into whatever that color I clicked on, that dark blue. But if I click on the light blue area here, it'll pick from one of these colors, and you can see that, you know, the Drake text is now in a lighter blue color. I could do it from here, I could do it from here. The concept is exactly the same. So that'll allow you to have kind of a consistent color scheme where your font, you know, kind of has the same color as, you know, something in your image. Now let me go ahead and click OK. I'm actually going to turn off the color overlay for now. And what I want to do is now go to pattern overlay. So if I select that and go to pattern overlay, this is where the options are. And if I click on this little arrow here, it allows me to pick from, you know, all the different patterns that I have. Now here I have a couple patterns that I already created myself at another point. There are a couple patterns that are built in, like this one, for example. And you can see that the text is now populated with this particular pattern. So real quick, I'll show you how to create a pattern for yourself. Let me go ahead and click on cancel. What I'm going to do is I'm going to click on file, then go to new, and I'm just going to create a new image. It really doesn't matter what the size is. I'm going to click OK. So I can go online and Google, you know, texture, find something you like. It really doesn't matter what it is. Let me go ahead and type in. You do want something that is fairly big, so I'm going to pick like a large, and then let me go down here. So here's an OK one. Let me go ahead and left click on this and open it up. So this is the photo of the texture, and let me right click and then copy image. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to paste that image into here. As you can see, the background is a little bit bigger than the image. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the crop tool, and that will basically allow me to select a certain area, and it'll cut out everything that is not part of that area. So I'm going to click enter, and now all that background is gone. Now what I can do is I can go to edit, and then I can go down here to define pattern, and I can call it whatever I want. I'll call it steel, then I'll click on OK. And now when I go back here to my photo, I can go to my FX, then go to pattern overlay. And what that will do is if I left click here, you can see that this is the pattern that I created. And now you can see that inside of the Drake text, I have that background pattern image that I created. So I can use my mouse and kind of drag it around, and it'll look different, but that's because, you know, the background is basically this whole image here. So when I'm moving it around, you might only see this part right here, or maybe you'll see this part right here. But that's really something to play around with. If you want, you know, some kind of text effect, it's very easy to do. All you need to do is create a pattern. If I wanted this to be wood, I would have found a picture of like a wooden texture. It's really not that hard to do. But anyway, if you move it around, you know, go with something like this. I like, you know, maybe that general texture. However, I don't really like the color. So what I can do is I can click on color overlay, and you can see right now I can only see the color. Let me change that real quick to something like, so now I have kind of a blue color. Let me click OK. And what I can do is I can click on blend mode here. I'm going to go down to luminosity, and I'm just going to hit the arrow key up because that will allow me to cycle through all of these different filters I have. So all I'm going to do is click on up on the arrow key. And right now it's just going through all of these filters in this little drop down box. And I'm really just looking for something that I like. This one looks better. I still don't love the color. So what I can do is I can left click. I'm keeping the filter on, but I can go ahead and move this around and kind of find the color that looks good to me. But notice, you know, some colors, they don't really blend in as well. If I go with a darker color, you can see more of that texture background, but the brighter colors, they kind of cover it up. So you really have to play around with the blending and find something that looks good to you. So for example, here I have soft light selected, and I have my color green, and I can actually change the opacity of the color, and you can see that it decreases or increases the amount of total color I have. So I can make this more of a pale green, make it more subtle so you can barely notice that it's green. There are other effects that you can add. The only one I really want to talk about is stroke. If I left click on that, all that did, as you can see, is it created like a black background around the actual text. And I can change the color of the stroke like anything. However, you know, for the most part, these don't really look very good to me. And again, you don't want to overdo it. I think it's really easy to get carried away and, you know, do something that's really over the top. But sometimes, you know, it really is a better idea to just keep everything very simple. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the color overlay, and I'm going to get rid of the pattern overlay. And all I have really is white text, and maybe I'll add a stroke to it. So I'll increase the size of the stroke. I don't want it to be crazy big, but I'll keep it, you know, something like that. And let me click on drop shadow so that's still there. And for now, I'll go ahead and click OK. Now, one more thing I can do is I can click on this photo of Drake and I can right click and then duplicate. And that will create a duplicate of that layer. So now you can see I have two different Drake layers going on. In fact, if I were to click one and move it, you can see I have, Drake on top of Drake. But let me go ahead and Control Z. And all that did was undo my movement. So these photos are still both here. And what I can do is I can actually press Control A. And then I'll press Control U, and that will bring up this panel with hue and saturation. So I can click on colorize, and notice that it changed the color of the entire photo. And I can play around with all of these little sliders. I can make it darker, or I can make it brighter. I can increase the saturation. I can change the color so that it is, red, blue, green, whatever. So real quick, I'll go ahead and make this something like red, lower the saturation, maybe up the lightness. And for now, I'll go ahead and click OK. And what I want to do now is I want to go ahead and click on this drop down bar here. And this is pretty much the same thing where you have a bunch of different filters. So what I'm going to do is click on luminosity. And something I didn't fully explain, these aren't really like Snapchat or Instagram filters. They are kind of, but what these are really doing is they're blending the two different layers together with different types of blending modes. So the result that you get ultimately is going to be based on the colors you have on your bottom layer and then the colors you have on your top layer. So if I go ahead and click on the up arrow, I'm going to scroll through all of these filters. And I'm going to try to find something that I like. This looks okay. But real quick, I'm going to go ahead and Control A and Control U. And again, I'm going to click on colorize, and that allows me to control the colors of the top layer here. Notice that now on the bottom right, you can see that it's green. So what I can do is I can increase the saturation. You can see the top layer is now, all green. So if I move this around, even if the top layer doesn't look, red here, you can tell that the top layer is red because, in the layer panel, this is all red. The only reason it's kind of orange and green right now is because it's combining the top layer with the bottom layer, which is all blue. So I can play around with these knobs again and try to find something that looks good to me. And for now, that'll be good enough. Let me go ahead and click OK. Another thing I can do is, again, I can adjust the opacity of the top layer. So basically what that means is you can kind of see through it a little bit more if I lower it down to something like, if I lower it to 0, you can't see the top layer at all. But if I have it at like 50%, you can see a little bit of the top layer, but mostly the bottom layer. But if I turn it all the way up, then, you have more of the top layer coming through. However, because of the blending, it's not the same as if, you only saw the top layer. If I only wanted to see the top layer, I would click on the blending mode and put this back to normal. And this is only the top layer without any type of effect added onto it. And if I have the opacity at 100%, I cannot see through it at all, so I can only see the top layer. I cannot see any of the bottom layer. However, even when I have the blending mode on normal, I can lower the opacity, and you can see I can see more of the bottom layer depending on how much of the top layer I have selected. So these are all things to look at and play around with when you're blending and trying to create a album cover or any type of graphic, really. Now I want to show you something else, but I'm going to go ahead and start a new project. So real quick, I'm going to create a new project, file, new, okay. And I'm going to paste a photo. And one thing that you can do is you can click on this little tool right here. I think they call it the magic wand tool. So this is Mac Miller, rest in peace. And if I left click on the image here, what it'll do is it'll create kind of a selection tool that goes all around his body. So if I can click on delete, it'll basically delete everything except for his photo. And then at that point, all I really need to do is copy and paste some kind of image, and I got to put it behind him. It's, right now I have it on top. So if I go ahead and click on this and then move the image, you can essentially change the background to pretty much anything you want to. You do want to make sure that you do like a little bit of blending and try to make it look kind of like the photo actually belongs with the background. You don't want it to look too out of place. So for example, if I Control A and then Control U, and then I'm going to go ahead and colorize and kind of get like maybe a little bit of a blue tint going on. And again, you can, adjust the opacity and, turn it up, turn it down, change like the blending mode and the color, and try to get something that looks, somewhat reasonable where, it doesn't look very out of place. I don't want to spend too much time on it. But as you can see, it's very easy to change out the background in this way. If I were to, paste in a different background, again, all I need to do is move it behind and then kind of, adjust it a little bit. And this isn't perfect. Again, you want to, try to play around with the sizing so it makes sense. You want to try to play around with the blending so it makes more sense. But at the end of the day, it's very easy to take a photo and just kind of cut out the background and, change around the background image. Now, with that being said, not every photo is that easy to work with. For example, I pasted in that Drake photo on top of everything else. So let me go ahead and right click and get rid of Mac Miller here. So notice that I still have this background going on. I just have Drake on top of it. All I really need to do is get rid of this background here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to left click here, and you can see the selection tool again going around him, although it does miss a lot over here, and then it misses all this over here. So I'm going to go ahead and click on delete. And for the most part, it seems okay. It missed a bunch of this stuff, and it did miss all this stuff over here. Now what I can do is I can left click on this little lasso tool, and the lasso tool basically kind of like gathers up all of a certain area. So if I go ahead and left click on my screen and drag it and then kind of make a loop here, you can see that the selection tool now is going all around this area right here. So if I click on delete, it'll delete everything on this layer in this area. Notice that it's not deleting anything in the background because I'm only selecting from this top layer right now. If I wanted to delete from the background, I would have to select that layer. And then if I were to click on delete, notice that all that disappeared. And that's because, I have the selection tool selected right here, but right here, I'm working with the layer underneath it. But I'm going to go ahead and Control Z and undo that and go ahead and select my top layer here with Drake in it. So that's all great, but I still have all this background over here that I haven't accounted for. So let me go ahead and try to use the wand tool again. If I go ahead and left click here, that seems to be okay. Again, still missing a lot. So if I click on delete, and then if I click on the lasso tool and just click on the screen once, I still have a lot of stuff left over. And then even worse, when I look down here at the arm, it kind of gets blown to smithereens here. And that's kind of hard to work with. I can keep trying to use the lasso tool, but notice now it's kind of overlapping. And if I were to delete here, it'll actually delete part of his shirt. So this really isn't good. I'm gonna go ahead and left click on the screen with the lasso tool. That'll just unselect everything I had selected. Now I could go through and try to lasso each one of these little items here and try to, do my best to make sure I'm not cutting out part of the image. Although eventually it'll get to the point where I think I'm cutting out part of his arm. So I'm going to Control Z and basically undo all of that. So the alternative thing I can do is I can go up here to the lasso tool, I can right click, and then they have a magnetic lasso tool. And what I can do is I can try to zoom in, and I can basically pick an area that I want to start from. And what I can do is I can kind of left click in the photo and kind of set little points that are telling basically the AI in the computer, these parts right here are all part of the image. And if I create enough of these points and I spend a long enough time doing it, I can basically go all the way around his body, and hopefully the AI will be able to detect and say, okay, these are all parts of the actual image that you want to keep, and everything else is part of the image that you want to get rid of. So the real thing here is having a lot of patience, and I normally don't have that kind of patience, where you have to go through and select one by one over and over, and the more points that you have, the more accurate the algorithm is going to be at reading what it is that you want versus, what you want cut out. So I'm not going to do this entire image. I don't have that kind of patience. I'm just going to, stop right here. And then what I can do is I can come all the way back. You want to basically, make a full circle and then find one of the original points. And when you click on it, you can see the selection tool basically selects that whole area. And if I click on delete, it'll basically delete that area that the computer thinks is part of the image that you want to keep. And for the most part, that's pretty accurate. It kind of follows his clothing. This little crease in the clothing was already there. And that's a perfectly valid way to do it. It just takes a very long time. So another method that you can do to accomplish the same thing, however, it will not be perfect, but you can go over here to the left and click on the eraser tool, and you can left click up here. This will be the type of brush that you're using when you're erasing. And what I want to do is select one of those brushes that I downloaded in the earlier video, and I can change the size of it. I can make it really big or I can make it really small. For now, I'm just going to have it around 126, and I can just left click and I can use my eraser tool in order to manually kind of erase everything in the background. And I can also, go in and I can, use a really small eraser tool. So again, going back to the eraser, and if I select, a smaller pixel size, I can go in and try to cut out, the areas where it gets really close to his body, so I'm not cutting out, too much of the wrong thing. And for the most part, this probably won't look too bad. Really, the more you have going on in the background, the better it'll look when it kind of blends all together. So again, I can just go through, kind of, do a quick job where I'm trying to, get rid of the main parts that aren't anywhere near him. And whenever I get to an area that's, a little bit more confined and harder to work with, I'll make the brush even smaller. And you can still try to use your magic wand tool, which, if you haven't quite figured it out, basically what it does is kind of compare. And when you have a really big color change, like for example here you have blue and then here you have kind of like his skin color, that is a pretty obvious change going on, which is why it's pretty easy for the magic lasso to pick up on that. However, you can see that here it's like a darkish color and then it goes into a dark color again, and kind of this gray area kind of looks a little bit like this same color right here. So when I use the lasso tool on something like this, it doesn't always pick up, but sometimes it'll work out fine. Shadows are always, a big pain to work with. But again, if I left click here, it seems to be doing okay once I kind of, brush away all the outside. And it seems to be doing an okay job of picking out the correct area. Now again, notice it kind of blew up his arm here. And I would have to go back and mess with it. Really, that's because, again, you have the shadow, which is a darker color, and then that kind of blends in more with the dark background. So the magic wand tool is not as good at picking that up. So I could always go in and try to manually brush away, this particular shadow, because at least I have a little more control over what I'm getting rid of and what I'm keeping. And then once you kind of get rid of that whole shadow connection to the background, you should eventually get to the point where you're able to click on it and it's not trying to cut out that part right here. So trying to do something like that where you're trying to cut out the background, it can take a lot of time. You really just have to have patience with it and just keep on going through and either trying to erase it with an eraser tool or trying to use a lasso tool or trying to use a magic wand tool. Either way, if you spend enough time on it, you should eventually get it down to the point where it looks, pretty clean and, it looks like you did it well. The more time you spend on it, obviously, the better it's going to be. So I'm not really going to get any more involved with that than I already have. I just wanted to point out one thing. If you have a brush like this one, for example, it's a little bit harder to blend it because, as you can see, it keeps on making like these little squares in the background, and it's not quite as smooth as, the other brush that I was working with, because it's very obvious when you have like a really blunt edge on the top here, and you can tell it doesn't really blend in quite as well as the other brush. Here it just kind of blends in more to the background, and you could tell that the transition is a little bit smoother, especially on this side, on the right side, where it's like transitioning from the background image into the foreground image, whereas here it's very blunt. You can see, the squares, which is why when I, use a brush like this to erase, I like to have something with a lot of edges to it and kind of like a fade where it doesn't, cut off, completely bluntly. Hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. I guess maybe I'll cover one last thing. So real quick, I'm going to create one more image. Let's say I want to do like a little promotional type of thing. So I'm going to go ahead and type 1000 by 1000. Another thing you can do is you can go to a website like flaticon.com and you can just type in, anything really. If I type in rapper, they have, a bunch of different icons that represent, rappers. For example, they had this headphone one. I'm going to go ahead and left click on that, and I'm going to go ahead and left click here and do a free download. I need to attribute the author, who is Eucalypt on flaticon.com. And what I can do is I can show in folder, I can drag and then drop this into Photoshop. And now I have this icon in Photoshop. Now one thing I can do to try to make it bigger is I can click on the corner and I can hold down Shift and drag. And what that will do is basically allow me to make it bigger, but also keep all the proportions the same. If I don't click on Shift and I drag, you can see that, it gets all distorted and warped and it doesn't necessarily look good. But if I Control Z and undo that, and if I click on the corner holding down Shift and then drag, you can see that it preserves the actual dimensions of everything. It just makes it all bigger. So if I go ahead and click on the arrow here, it'll ask me if I want to place it, and then I can move this into the middle. Now real quick, one thing I want to do, I want to right click and rasterize the layer. So remember when I was making everything bigger, it had to be considered like a vector layer in order for me to change the proportions of everything, but still maintain all of the information. This is all stored in the computer mathematically, but when I rasterize the layer, basically I'm just kind of committing to those changes that I made. So now I can't really use that sizing to make it bigger and smaller the way that I was able to do it earlier. There are other ways to do it, but that's not really important. But rasterizing the layer will allow me to do this. And I'm going to go ahead and left click here. This is the paint bucket tool. So if I come down here to the color palette, I can left click. Right now it's set at green. I'm going to change it to something like, I don't know, like a lightish blue. And then if I click OK, I can left click anywhere in here and it'll basically fill up that area with the color that I've selected. And this color palette that I have down here is really just kind of a quick selector. It gives me instant access to these two colors. All I have to do is select the little arrow and that will swap to my background color. So if I go ahead and left click here, I can change that to green. And that way, if I want to keep on going back and forth between, going green, then go to blue, then go to green again, it gives me a really quick way to access that. What the paint bucket does, hopefully you can see, is it kind of fills in the entire area with a certain color. I can also apply the paint bucket to the background and that will fill the entire area in. Notice that there's no black lines, so it literally just fills up everything with the color green. Now if I wanted to, I can change the color in here. I could find something like a red and then put it in the background, or what I can do is I can Control A, Control U, which is something I did before, and notice I have the background selected. So if I click on colorize, I can change the color in the background here. So if I change the saturation, I can find something that I like. For the record, notice that the front here is actually transparent. So it's not that I'm changing the color of these little headphone monitors right now. It's that there is no color selected. So it's going to automatically be the color of whatever is in the background. So let me just find a color in the background that I like real quick and click OK. And now I can go back to the top layer and continue, adding in colors. I can change them up. So let me go back to blue and then I'll go ahead and fill this in. Now I'm not really feeling the green here, so I'm going to change it to something else. And now I can just go in and add some kind of text. Then I'll just move that into the center here. If I want to, I can, again, space it out more. So I have, 200. Again, let me go ahead and center it. And hopefully, just like before, if you click on this little color palette, you still have the option to go through and click anything in the background, and that'll automatically select that color in the color palette. So if I wanted to click OK, and if I wanted to go down here to the headphones and then make the color right here the same as the red, I could do that. I could also change up the background. There's all kinds of things I could do. Photoshop definitely has a ton of other features that you should definitely learn about, but I think, if you want to make, rudimentary album covers or, graphic design, anything like this where you might need to do like a promotion for a brand new song you came out, having icons, it looks really professional. It's very simplistic. Composition is a big deal. A very simple graphic can go a long way if you just, kind of add in a little bit more text to it. So play around with the formatting of your text, the size of your text, where you have it placed, have the different spacing. I guess if there's any other one thing I wanted to teach you, if I go ahead and click on layer, and I'm going to create a new layer here, I can click on OK, and that creates a brand new layer. There's nothing in it. It's completely transparent and empty. So if I wanted to fill the layer with a certain color, I could do that, but it would cover up everything. I'll just show you an example of that though. So again, now my layer 1 is completely filled. However, I don't want to do that. I'm going to undo it. What I can do is I can click on this little rectangle here. So what I can do is I have my rectangle tool selected. I'm going to left click here and then kind of just drag it. And then I'll go ahead and left click. And all that does is create a selection. So now that I have that, I can click on my little paint bucket tool and then I can left click. I'm going to click on my lasso tool and click here just so it gets rid of that selection there. Notice that this layer is covering up my text, so I need to move it so it's underneath the text. I'm going to go ahead and move it up just a little bit. And again, I can Control A, Control U, and then colorize, and that'll allow me to change the color of this little background I have here. And if you wanted, you can set it to black, you can set it to another color. Right now, there's not a whole lot of room between the bar and the actual text itself, so I'm going to right click and then duplicate that layer. Okay. I'm just going to hit my down arrow key. This is the duplicate layer of that black bar, and it makes it look like it's bigger. It's actually two different ones on top of each other, but it allows me to like visually see how much room I'm taking up. And what I can do is I can press Control E and it'll merge the layer down. So real quick, let me just move this to prove to you I have two different bars, but if I press Control Z, that goes back there. They're on top of each other. Because they're all black, they look like they're the same image, but they're not. If I press Control E, that'll merge the two layers together, and now they actually are one image. I can go ahead and move this down a little bit if I want, and then move the text down. However, if I want to move the text for both of these layers down, what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click and then again rasterize type. So I can no longer edit the actual text, and I can right click here and then rasterize. But now that'll allow me to merge these two layers together. I wasn't able to merge them together until I rasterized it. Rasterizing just makes it so it's no longer a text object. I cannot change the actual font or anything like that. But it creates one, whole image that I can now move around and, and do essentially anything I want to with it. Another thing I can do is I can lower the opacity of the background here. So let me go ahead and colorize, and I'm going to actually make it a white background and then click OK. And then if I lower the opacity on it, you kind of have more of a subtle effect going on. And you can even do weird little design choices. Like if I click on the rectangle tool and I make a selection around this particular area right here, I can click on delete, and that will kind of delete that little section I had. And then I can do that one more time. And by doing that, you can create little designs and patterns. Now that's pretty much everything I wanted to show you. I just got one last thing. Let me go ahead and click on layer. I'm gonna go ahead and flatten the image. That took all of the images, and now they're all layered together. So I can no longer move things around the way I could before. But what I can do is I can press Control A, and then go to edit and then stroke. If you remember from earlier, when I apply stroke to a text, it basically creates a black background around the text. And it'll basically do the exact same thing here, where I can change the size of it. Right now I have it at 40 pixels, and I'm gonna click OK. And you can see it created this black background all around the border here. However, it did cover up part of my artist name, so I can go ahead and undo that. And again, Control A, I'm gonna make it a smaller stroke now. I'll do something like 10 pixels and then click OK. And now it still has that black background. It's not quite as prevalent, but now it doesn't cover up my artist name. Now in actuality, I would probably just move my artist name in more, but I don't want to spend too much time on this. That is pretty much everything I wanted to show you how to do. I think if you learn how to do all these techniques well, you can definitely make, your own promotional album covers, graphics, flyers. There are a lot of things to know about Photoshop and things that you could know, but I think, everything here is the very fundamental and more than enough to, get by and really get out there and start creating your own album covers and graphic design. Again, just remember that, sometimes being simple and making small changes and not trying to be too over the top is the better way to go. I guess one last thing I want to talk about is a filter called Topaz, and this is a lot more like the Snapchat filters you're probably used to. You have some customization where you can control it more, but if you go out there and download this, it's really a plug and play. You don't need any type of tutorial at all, other than, kind of what I've already taught you how to do in Photoshop. But if you apply a filter, you can kind of get more of a cartoonish figure. You can also get this kind of DSLR effect where they have really sharp edges. This is a great example. You can see how his beard has really sharp edges, and you can kind of see like every single individual hair. And that's because, somebody applied this Topaz type of filter effect. So definitely look into that if you have any interest. I'm sure you can find YouTube videos that'll advertise it better. I've used it before. I love it. I think it's really cool. And it's also really easy to make, cartoon type of effects. I mean, you could potentially do something kind of like this, where you can take a photo and, apply a filter and it kind of becomes animated. So definitely look into that if you have any interest in it. But for now, that's pretty much everything I wanted to cover. Hopefully you enjoyed this tutorial and you learned something. And until next time, keep on making music, keep on making graphics, and keep trying to do everything you can do to, be a better artist.